liberal or conservative, independent, what your faith is, what your sexual orientation is. Out of many, one. But if we're not careful, that one's going to fall based on what we do. And the debt affects a liberal as much as it affects a conservative. It steals opportunity from liberal children as much as it does conservative children. And we have to come to a point where we say enough is enough. We're there. You know, I was just thinking as the senator talked, the $50 billion that we're going to borrow from our kids with this bill, it'll run the entire state of Oklahoma's government for 8 years. Every branch, every employee, pay all the costs, build all the highways, do everything we do for 8 years. Just on what we're going to borrow. I mean, when you start putting it down into how much is $50 billion, we throw away on billions like there were pennies here. And how many thousand years?
31,709.
$31,709 trillion. So we're going to have a $1.6 trillion deficit this year. Well, that's 50,000 years of seconds. Just this year. It's 50,000 years of seconds. Well, let me go into the amendment a little bit and kind of talk about it. The first section of this amendment would require public disclosure of the amount of any new borrowing or spending approved by the Senate. In other words, it's about transparency. It's about letting the American people hold us accountable. It means that on the Senate website, after we make new spending decisions and borrowing decisions, we have to publish it so the American people can see it, rather than hide behind it. It's real simple. There's no score for it on savings. I'll guarantee you it'll save money. Because if we know the American people really are going to know what the financial consequences are of what we do with every vote, it's going to change some votes around here. And the other question we ought to be asking is, why shouldn't they know what we're doing and the ramifications of it? It's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. I've told the Rules Committee that I would pay out of my personal office budget the cost of that programming. In other words, it won't cost, I turn back over $500,000 every year. I'll pay for it out of my budget to make sure that's available on the site. So there's no cost to it whatsoever. I'll pay for it out of my budget, out of my office. So it doesn't cost us anything, but it gives the transparency that the President and I worked on in this body, and he would like to see from this body, and it makes it available to the American people. So we're going to get a vote on that. And it is important to note, with this bill, if it passes, we will have borrowed 5920, that's 79, 89, 97, 143, 153, 252, plus 50, $302 billion just since February 14th. Outside of the budget. Outside of the budget. Now, you know, $300 billion, that'll run Oklahoma 40 years. You could run the whole state of Oklahoma on what we've done in 6 months for 40 years. So why shouldn't we let the American people see what we're doing? Since it's going to cost nothing, and it's transparency, so they can hold us accountable. Why should we not do that? The second thing that's important is in the last year, we have markedly increased, not counting the stimulus bill, the discretionary spending of the federal government. And we didn't leave ourselves out on that. Inflation was nothing, and we increased our own budget 4.8%. So the other component of this, one of these amendments, is that 4.8%, I say we give $100 million of it back, which would be a third of that. That means we still get 3 times what the rest of the country got in terms of increase, but it shows at least we're willing to live. And if anybody ran their office with any appropriateness, they would have a surplus as well every year. So it's not a hard cut, but it is important that since we gave ourselves a budget increase, that we demonstrate to the American people that we're serious about doing it. So vote against it and say you don't think so, or vote for it, and let's put it in this bill. Let's start showing the American people we get it. We'll do the right best thing for the country in the long term. I have occasional conversations with the president, and one of the things that he has told his administration to do, and we heard it flatly rejected, not just rejected, flatly rejected on the basis of a lack of knowledge by the chairman of the Finance Committee. He has told every agency to find 5% in cuts. That's what he's getting. That's instructions that he sent out, the head of every agency. Why has he done that? Because he knows we have to. And this portion of the amendment says that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to cut 5% of the discretionary spending of every branch of government save defense and veterans by 5%. Some would say, well, that's 1/20 of their budget. Yes, it is. But when you look at, in light of the size of the agencies today, in the last 10 years, they're twice as big as they were 10 years ago. They've averaged grown by 10% per year. And we can't find 5% or 1/5 of the growth that they've had over the last 10 years that can be done more efficiently or is lower priority or is not as important. We can't find that. And yet every family, as the senator from Georgia in this country, almost every family is having to do that. And we refuse to mandate that the federal government get on a diet, do things more efficiently, more effectively, take another look. Can it be done a different way? It's called productivity increases. We can get that. We won't ever get it if we don't ask for it. It is not a hard concept that we can do that. And we allow the agencies to make those recommendations. And that's one of the things President Obama's already asked all his agencies to do, is to go find that 5%. That sends a wonderful signal to the American people that we get it. It does something else that's really important. And so will the defeat of this bill and we pass it with it being paid for. You know, right now in this country, the value of our dollar is pretty good. And the reason it's good is because people are worried about the value of the yen, and they're significantly worried about the euro because of what's happening to Greece, and now what is getting ready to happen to Spain. So money is rushing in. Smart money around the world in these other economies is rushing to hide in dollars. In about 2 years from now, that money is going to go sucking back out of here, because those economies will have made the hard choices of austerity with which to restabilize the euro or their currencies. They will have done it. What we need to send to the international financial market is a signal that says we too are way overextended, and we're going to start making the appropriate choices to secure our financial future. Now, it was just 2 months ago that Moody's put a notice out that said if things don't happen and start to change with U.S. government bonds, they're going to be downgraded from AAA to AA. That is a big downgrade. We've never had a AA rating. So all of a sudden, the world rating system is going to say that maybe the investment in our product, our dollars, is not what it should be. We need to make sure that doesn't happen. We need to make sure we've sent a signal to the world. When we start doing things where we're paying for new things by cutting lower priority items, we send that signal. We build that confidence back up. And when we start paying for new bills and the extensions of benefits, we extend that back up. We're going to hear, or actually we won't hear, because we won't hear anybody come out and debate against these things. What they will choose to do is to ignore it and then vote against them. So the American people won't hear a legitimate debate on why we shouldn't cut 5% across the board, letting them decide what areas are most important and recommending them to us. We just won't have a debate. We just won't debate, and then we'll kill it, thinking it'll go away. Well, you know what? The American people have gotten that already. That's not acceptable to the American people. If you think we shouldn't cut spending in the federal government, come out here and defend it. Come out here and give us a philosophical, logical reason why we ought to continue to steal from our children and grandchildren. We won't see that. We won't see a strong debate against each of the points that I'm going to make associated with this amendment. And the real question ought to be asked is why? Because it's indefensible to vote against it. That's why. You cannot see the waste, fraud, abuse, and duplication in this government and not say we can do better. Section 4 of the amendment eliminates non-essential government travel. Do you realize almost every government office now has audiovisual equipment for the ability to carry on a teleconference anywhere in this country and overseas? And yet last year we spent, 2 years ago we spent, the data's behind, we spent $13.8 billion on airline tickets and hotels for federal government employees, of which over half of it was non-essential. In 2006, $3.3 billion on airfare. 2007, $3.5 billion on airfare. In 2008, $4 billion on airfare. We can't get the numbers from 2009 yet. Hotel rooms, $2.3 billion, up to $2.5 billion. Car rentals from $423 million to $437 million. Most of this can be done by teleconferencing. Why wouldn't we say in a time when we're borrowing $1.6 trillion from our kids that maybe we ought to teleconference rather than get on an airplane? I can tell you it's a whole lot easier than traveling 1,600 miles twice a week. So what does this do? It saves us money. One of my favorite ways of saving money is to cap the printing cost in the federal government. And we have examples of it right here. Every day, we put a calendar of business out, we put an executive calendar out, and we publish the congressional record. And we print hundreds of thousands of copies. And you know what? It's all online. We can save $4 billion over the next 10 years by printing limited amounts of things that we need and not printing some things that everybody else has access to on a computer. Why would we not do that? Why would we not cap our printing costs? Just think of the thousands of acres of trees we can save every year. What we know is every year federal employees, through our direction, spend $1.3 billion on printing. And the analysis by GAO, 440 million of that is unnecessary. So over 10 years, that's 4.4 billion. That's 4.4 billion that we won't take from Madeline. Madeline and her other 3- and 4-year-olds won't have to pay it back. And remember, they won't be just paying 4.4 billion back. They'll be paying the compounded interest that will double that debt in 10 to 12 years. In 20 years, it'll triple it. In 30, it'll quadruple it. So they won't be paying 4.4 billion back. They'll be paying 20 billion back. Why would we not do that? Why would we not make this decision to do it? It's been rejected by this body in the past. Before the Bush administration left, I was working with them on unused federal real property. We have billions, if not hundreds of billions, of underutilized federal property that you own as taxpayers. We spend $8 billion a year maintaining buildings that we're not using. Now think about that. We're spending $8 billion a year maintaining buildings that we're not using. But we can't sell them because there's a little bill called the McKinney-Vento Act that says every used building in the federal government has to be offered as a homeless shelter first, even if it's an airplane hangar on a closed military base. So we've created a bureaucracy nightmare that doesn't allow us to do that. And consequently, we could take a tenth of the $8 billion we're spending and appropriate that directly to the homeless and save $7.2 billion a year. But this body has rejected that as well. They voted it down. Didn't give a reason for voting it down. They just voted it down. We have 46,745 underutilized properties, 18,849 properties that we're not using at all, a total of 65,000 properties with an estimated value that we're not utilizing of $83 billion. $83 billion of property that you're paying the maintenance on that we're not using that we could sell and pay for almost all of this bill. But we won't do it. And of course, we don't buy many properties anymore. And the reason for that is because of the way our budget's scoring, even though it'd be smarter to buy it, because the total cost of the buildings charged to the agency in the year in which the building's completed, none of the agencies are buying buildings anymore, they're renting them. We shouldn't be renting the first building. We should be getting rid of the $85 billion worth of buildings we don't need and buying buildings because you can own a building a lot cheaper than you can lease a building. Maybe not last year, but the commercial rates are coming back up. Yet we don't do it. Since 2005, out of this $85 billion, because of the bureaucratic nightmares of steps you have to go through, we've only sold $2.5 billion worth of $85 billion portfolio. Now, none of you would do that with your own property. If you had property out there that you owned and you were spending 10% of the value of that property every year maintaining it, and you weren't utilizing it, and you had an opportunity to sell it, you'd sell it. Not the federal government. We ought to be asking why. Who took a stupid pill to say not to do that? And some of the property is not of any value. So we ought to demolish it, because it costs less to demolish it does to maintain it. Let me just give you a little rundown on some of them. On the buildings that we now have, that we are utilizing, we have a maintenance backlog of $30.5 billion. So we're spending money on buildings that we don't want, maintaining them, but we can't take care of the buildings we have because we don't have enough money, because we're spending it on buildings that we don't want. Section 7 provides that the Department of Defense would auction new, unused, or excellent condition excess inventory to the highest bidder rather than transferring it at no cost to state agencies and others. You buy tons of stuff every year through the Defense Department that they don't need. Matter of fact, they don't even know what they have. And it's just sitting in warehouses around the country. And what do we do when we figure out we don't need it? We give it away. Well, when we're $13.2 trillion in debt, it's time to stop giving it away. It's time to get some value for the American taxpayers who paid retail price for that and turn around and sell it. It's been voted on before and rejected. I mentioned in my opening words about capping the total number of federal employees this year. That's called a hiring freeze. But it's not really a hiring freeze, because if you have retirements, you can replace them. We've added 160,000 federal employees in the last 16 months. We've only increased a net new jobs of about 450,000. So almost 50% of the net new jobs have been federal jobs, at a time when our deficit's going to be one of the highest on record. I say time out. I say do it with who you got. If you have retirements or people who leave, then replace them. But don't increase the numbers anymore. Those numbers don't include the census 441,000 temporary workers that we've hired that will go away. How else are we going to get our budget under control if we don't do it in terms of personnel? The other thing is, if you look at the process over the last few years on federal employees, and I'll say it again, discuss the fact that those of us who think we are at a crisis moment in our country and feel that we ought to be making tough choices would say that we ought to freeze global total salary costs. That's not a salary freeze per individual. That's just saying that in this department, this agency, here's how much you're going to spend on salaries, and we're not going to go up this year. We're not going to raise the total amount we spend on salaries this year. That still allows every manager great flexibility. You can promote and give raises to people who are performing, but you can't increase the total amount of money. Now, why is that important? There was an article in today's paper that the Office of Personnel Management is starting to look at it. Well, we've already looked at it. And here's what we know. In 1999, the average federal salary was $49,536. It's now $78,806. Inflation during that period of time averaged 2.4%. Salary increases during that period of time averaged 4%. 1.5 times the rate of private pay increases in this country. What happened to benefits? Average personal benefit per federal employee is nearing $40,000 per year. And depending on how much you make, that may seem like a lot or not. But when you look at the average private sector pay, it's $42,000. It's $36,000 less than the average federal employee pay. I don't want federal employees to get a cut. I just don't think we ought to increase them anymore at a time when most people aren't getting pay increases. I don't think we ought to increase federal pay. The benefit differential is even more stark. The average cost of benefits to the average person in this country who doesn't work for the federal government is $20,000 per year. So we have almost twice as rich a benefit, 1.5 to 2 times as rich a benefit for federal employees as everybody else in the country who's employed. I'm not saying cut them. I'm just saying for 1 year, let's don't let it increase. Let's do right by the American people who are struggling, and let's do right by the grandchildren and young children in this world, in our country, by putting some common sense into what is allowable in given a time that we're in crisis. We voted on that before. It's failed. Federal employees also have unpaid to the federal government $3 billion in back taxes that's not under dispute. Federal employees who that average $78,000 a year owe the federal government $3 billion. I say they ought to be paying it. I say it ought to be coming out of their wages. I say it's time to not allow that as a condition of your employment anymore. It seems unconscionable to me that you can not pay your taxes, make $78,000 a year, and we're not going to force you to pay them. So it's a $3 billion savings, but it is an important signal to send to people is we're all paying taxes. You ought to too, since you make 1.5 times what the average person in this country makes. We talked earlier about Section 11. It eliminates the awarding of bonuses to government contractors when they have unsatisfactory performance. That's a no-brainer. Nobody in the private sector is going to give a bonus to somebody that isn't performing, but the federal government does all the time. We need to statutorily say you can't do that anymore. Section 13 is a bill. We now know that we spent $6.2 billion at the United Nations last year. We have no transparency from them on how our money was spent. We know we account for 25% of their regular budget and 26% of the peacekeeping budget. We did get a little piece of leaked data that was on an audit. What we do know that is nearly 40% of the money spent on peacekeeping is defrauded. Our voluntary additional contributions to the UN are $1.3 billion last year. All this amendment says is don't give more than $1 million to an incompetent organization that you can't find out where they're spending our taxpayers' money. Actually, it's kind of a ridiculous amendment. Why would we let them have $1 billion? But at least save $300 million every year, or $3 billion over the next 10 years by not allowing that to go forward. I want to talk about one other thing that I think is important that most of this body has voted against several times, but We have $1.7 trillion sitting in the bank of money that the Congress has appropriated to be spent in out years. Almost $700 billion of that has not been obligated for anything. Yet we've got T-bonds and T-bills that we're paying interest on while that sits over there. Prudent management would say, rather than borrow money, more money, you would use money from a bank account that you already have rather than borrow more. And so this portion of the amendment takes $50 billion out of that $700 billion. We ought to eliminate it all if it's unobligated. I recognize that they have to have some movement back and forth, but they'll never notice that $50 billion isn't in the unobligated balances. And when that expenditure comes, we can appropriate additional money for it. But what we're doing is we're letting money sit idle while we borrow additional money to do additional things. So this just simply says we move $50 billion out of that. Section 18 is about getting energy efficiency at the Department of Energy. Section 19, and I talked to the senator, one of the senators from California on this amendment. I'm not opposed to fixing the problems with Medicare statistical inaccuracies in their payments, but I am opposed to not fixing it for the 5 other states that have it as well. It is unfair to take the state of California when the states of, and I'll give them to you, the states of Georgia, Minnesota, Ohio, and Virginia all have exactly the same problem. Yet in this bill, as you heard Senator Grassley earlier say, we only fixed one of the states. Folks, that's called an earmark. Now, there's nothing wrong with fixing it for California, but there's plenty wrong with fixing it for California but not fixing it for these other 4 states. If it's something that needs to be fixed, why would we advantage California over these other states? It's called favoritism. It's called exceptionalism. It says that the citizens of California are worth more in this country than the citizens in Ohio and Georgia and Virginia and Michigan. They're not. So if it's a problem that needs to be addressed, let's address the whole problem. Why didn't they address the whole problem? Because it would have cost more money. We're going to borrow $400 million per year to fix it in California, and that's okay, but it's not okay to fix it in the other states. That's inherently unfair. It borders on the unethical, and it's exactly the type of thing that the American people reject. If there's a problem, fix it for everybody. Don't single out one group of people at the expense of the rest of Americans. And then finally, this amendment eliminates all tax increases in this bill. The last thing we need to be doing right now is decreasing capital formation in this country, decreasing the ability to invest in new ideas, decreasing the capability of small businesses, which this bill goes after in terms of their subchapter S status, and make it more expensive to start a new business or keep one running when 70% of the jobs that are created in this country, and we're hurting for jobs, are created by small business. So this amendment has 20 segments. We're going to have 20 votes. We're going to see where this body lines up on these issues. Vote against common sense at your peril. Vote against the future of our country. Vote against Madeline and everybody else like her. Vote to increase the debt even higher. Vote to increase the size of the federal government. Vote to undo pay-go again. Continue doing what we're doing. And what we will see is the American people are going to reject that. They're rejecting it now. And it's high time we started listening to the American people. Mr. President, I yield the floor and notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.